Nira, what is this? What's happening?
You should have stayed in Nigeria, brother.
Nira, say something. Please.
I told you, I don't like being touched.
Who were these men, and what were they doing to that man in the shadows? David Okoye was not the kind of man who believed in love at first sight, especially not the kind that began with a message on a screen. But when he met Nira, everything changed. It started like any modern love story. A random friend request on a social media app, a simple hi, followed by a slow but steady exchange of messages. Nira was a beautiful Thai woman, with long, silky black hair and a delicate face that seemed almost too perfect in her pictures. She was charming, funny, and affectionate, always knowing the right words to say to make David feel special. David was a Nigerian man in his late 20s, working a stable job in Lagos. His life was ordinary: work, home, and the occasional night out with friends. But Nira became his escape. Every evening, he found himself glued to his phone, waiting for her messages, her voice notes, the little things that made his otherwise dull routine exciting. At first, it was casual flirting, but soon, their conversations turned into something deeper. They spoke about their dreams, their fears, their hopes for the future. Nira told him about Thailand, about the beautiful beaches, the vibrant street markets, and the temples that glowed under the golden sun. She made it sound like paradise. And David? He was completely drawn in. But love, especially the kind that exists through a phone screen, has its blind spots. There were things that didn't add up. Whenever David suggested a video call, Nira always had an excuse. Her camera was broken, the lighting was bad, or she was too shy. "I don't look good on video," she would say, giggling. It became a pattern, one that David ignored because he didn't want to push her. She also avoided talking about her past. When he asked about her family, she kept things vague. "They live far away," she'd say, quickly changing the topic. David's friends warned him. They told him to be careful, that people online weren't always who they claimed to be. But love makes a man reckless. After months of talking, David made a decision. "I want to see you, Nira. I want to come to Thailand." For the first time, there was silence between them. Then, a soft reply. "Are you sure?" "Yes, more than anything." There was another pause before she said, "I'd love that." And that was all the confirmation David needed. 2 weeks later, he was on a plane to Bangkok, carrying nothing but a suitcase, his passport, and a heart full of expectations. David stepped off the plane with a racing heart and shaky hands. Bangkok's airport buzzed with life. Tourists dragging luggage, taxi drivers calling out for fares, and the scent of street food drifting in the air. He was finally here. After months of waiting, of dreaming, of imagining what it would be like to finally meet Nira, the moment had arrived. And then he saw her. She stood near the arrival gates, a soft smile on her lips. She was exactly like her photos. Long black hair, smooth skin, and delicate features that made his breath catch in his throat. Felt surreal. For a moment, he worried she might not recognize him. But as soon as their eyes met, she waved, her smile widening. David hurried toward her, arms outstretched for a hug. But just as he was about to wrap her in his arms, she took a small step back. "Sorry," she said with a nervous laugh. "I get shy in public." He frowned but shrugged it off. Maybe she was just nervous. After all, this was their first time meeting in person. "It's so good to finally see you," he said, smiling. "You too," she replied. But her voice lacked the warmth he was used to. Instead of leading him toward a taxi stand, she gestured to a sleek black car parked nearby. "I already arranged a ride for us." David had assumed they would stay in a hotel, maybe one of the nice ones near the beach, the kind he had seen in pictures. But as the car wove through the streets of Bangkok, the bright city lights slowly faded, replaced by quieter, unfamiliar neighborhoods. "Where are we going?" he asked. "A private rental," Nira said, her fingers twisting in her lap. "It's better than a hotel. More private. Just us." Something about the way she said it made David uneasy. When they finally arrived, the building wasn't what he had expected. It wasn't a hotel or a cozy Airbnb. It was a small, isolated apartment with heavy curtains drawn over the windows. The doors looked reinforced, thicker than normal. A strange unease settled in his chest. "Are you sure this is safe?" he asked as she unlocked the door. Nira turned to him with a reassuring smile. "Of course. Don't worry." Inside, the apartment was clean but strangely empty. The walls were bare, and the air smelled slightly musty, as if no one had been living there for a while. There was only one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living room with minimal furniture. "You must be tired," Nira said quickly. "I ordered food for us." They ate together, but something was off. She barely touched her food, picking at it absent-mindedly. When he tried to hold her hand, she flinched before forcing a smile. Later that night, when David finally tried to kiss her, she stiffened. "Not tonight," she whispered, turning away. "I'm just really tired." David lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. Something was wrong. Then, in the silence of the night, he heard it. A whisper. It was faint, almost too quiet to notice. He held his breath, listening closely. The sound was coming from behind the bedroom wall. Low voices murmuring in a language he didn't understand. He sat up, heart pounding. Was there another room behind the wall? Before he could think too much, he noticed something else. Nira was awake. She sat at the edge of the bed, completely still, her back facing him. The dim glow of a streetlight barely illuminated her figure. "Nira?" he whispered. She didn't respond. When she finally turned, her expression was unreadable. Then, without a word, she lay down and closed her eyes, as if nothing had happened. At midnight, as he slowly stepped out of the bedroom to get some water, he saw Nira standing in the living room, whispering into her phone. Her tone was tense. Then, she glanced over her shoulder and saw him watching. She ended the call immediately. "Who was that?" he asked. She forced a smile. "Just my friend. Don't worry about it." But David was worried, and for the first time he wondered if coming here had been a mistake. The next morning, David wasn't sure what time it was when he woke up, but something felt wrong. His limbs were heavy, his head clouded with a strange dizziness. The room around him swayed, as if the walls themselves were moving. He blinked, trying to clear his vision. His body felt weak, unnaturally weak. "What the hell?" he mumbled, struggling to sit up. His throat was dry, his muscles unresponsive. Felt like he had been drugged. But how? The last thing he remembered was eating dinner with Nira. Had she? Before he could process the thought, a noise in the darkness made his skin crawl. The soft creak of a door. Then footsteps. Shadows shifted in the dim room. Figures emerged, moving like ghosts in the night. Men, 4 of them, dressed in dark clothes, their faces hidden behind masks. David's heart slammed against his ribs as panic gripped him. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his body wouldn't obey. "Who are you?" His voice was barely above a whisper, slurred and weak. No one answered. The men moved quickly. Before he could react, rough hands grabbed his arms, pulling him up. Another pair of hands clamped around his legs. David thrashed, his movements sluggish, his strength betraying him. "No, no, no, no." A strip of cloth was forced over his mouth, muffling his protests. His arms were wrenched behind his back, thick rope digging into his skin as they bound him. His legs followed, tied tightly at the ankles. Panic turned into raw terror. And then he saw her, standing by the doorway. Nira. She watched in silence, her face unreadable, her dark eyes locked onto his struggling form. "Nira!" David tried to scream her name, but the gag choked his words. His pleading eyes begged her to stop this, to help him, to say something. Anything. But she didn't move. She didn't even flinch. She just stood there, watching, cold, emotionless, like a stranger. A fresh wave of horror washed over him. The next moment, when David opened his eyes, his head banging like a drum, a deep, sickening nausea churned in his stomach, and his throat felt raw as if he had been screaming. Took him a moment to realize why. He was tied down, His arms and legs were strapped to something cold and metallic. A table. The air was thick with the stench of sweat, blood, and something rotten. The dim glow of a single overhead bulb flickered, barely illuminating the room. A basement. His pulse spiked as he took in his surroundings. Scattered across the damp floor were other men. Some unconscious, others groaning in pain. Their clothes were tattered, their faces hollow, drained of life. Then he saw something that made his stomach drop. A man, barely breathing, lay curled up in the corner, his shirt stained red. A thick, dirty bandage was wrapped around his side. His face was pale, his skin clammy, his chest rising and falling in slow, shallow breaths. It took David only a second to understand. His kidney, it was gone. A choked gasp escaped his lips. This wasn't just a kidnapping. This was an organ smuggling operation. And he was next. Panic seized his chest, and his breathing was rough. He pushed against the barriers, his wrists burning as the ropes dug into his skin. "Help!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "Somebody help me!" A soft chuckle echoed from the darkness. His blood ran cold. From the shadows, a figure stepped forward, heels clicking against the concrete floor. Nira. But she was different now. Gone was the shy, soft-spoken woman he had fallen in love with. She stood before him, arms crossed, a wicked smirk twisting her lips. Her once warm eyes were now empty, devoid of any emotion. "Scream all you want," she said casually, tilting her head. "No one's coming." David's heart pounded so hard it hurt. "Why?" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Nira rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on, David. Did you really think I loved you? That we had some beautiful, once-in-a-lifetime romance?" She let out a cruel laugh. "You were just another idiot desperate for love, just like the others." She gestured toward the unconscious men on the floor. "Men like you are easy, lonely, desperate, so eager to believe in a fantasy." She crouched beside him, her fingers trailing along his arm. "All it takes is a few sweet words, a couple of fake pictures, and you're hooked, like a fish on a line." David felt like he was going to be sick. You sell people's organs?" he stammered, his voice shaking. She grinned. "Kidneys, livers, sometimes hearts, if the price is right." She shrugged. "There's a huge market for it, you know. People will pay millions for a healthy organ. And you, David? You're in perfect condition." His stomach lurched. "Please, you don't have to do this," he whispered, desperation clawing at his throat. Nira leaned in close, her lips near his ear. "Oh, but I do." She stood up and snapped her fingers. The door creaked open. Two masked men stepped inside. "Get him prepped." David thrashed wildly, pure terror coursing through his veins. "No, please, don't do this." But Nira just smirked. "Sweet dreams, love." Then a sharp prick at his neck. Darkness swallowed him whole. David lost all sense of time in that basement. Days passed in a blur of hunger, pain, and fear. His body grew weaker with each passing hour, barely surviving on the scraps of food they fed him. Just enough to keep him alive, but never enough to regain his strength. His throat was parched, his muscles ached, and his mind teetered on the edge of despair. He wasn't the only one suffering. The other captives barely moved. Some moaned in their sleep, others didn't wake up at all. But David refused to give up. Even in his weakest moments, he watched, listened. He studied the guards, their routines, their movements. He noted who carried weapons, who seemed careless, and who got distracted easily. And then, one night, it happened. A small mistake. One of the guards came in to check on them. He muttered something in Thai, kicked one of the unconscious guys to see if they were still breathing, and then turned toward the door. But he didn't close it fully. David's heart pounded. His mind screamed at him to move, to take the risk. It was now or never. Gathering every bit of strength left in his battered body, he pushed himself up. His legs wobbled beneath him, but he gritted his teeth, forcing himself forward. He crawled toward the door, each step very slow. He reached the threshold, freedom was just beyond it. Then creak. The floorboard beneath his foot betrayed him. Scarface spun around, his eyes widening in surprise. David didn't think, he acted. With a surge of desperation, he lunged at the guard, slamming his weak but determined fist into the man's throat. Scarface staggered back, gasping for air, and David took his chance. He grabbed a rusted metal pipe from the floor and swung it with everything he had. The pipe cracked against the side of the man's skull with a sickening thud. The guard crumpled to the ground. David didn't stop to see if he was dead or unconscious. He bolted, barefoot, bleeding, his vision blurring from exhaustion. He sprinted through the narrow, dimly lit hallways. The walls felt like they were closing in, a maze with no clear exit. His pulse pounded in his ears. Doors, locked, more hallways, endless. His lungs burned, but he kept going, his body running on pure adrenaline. Then, finally, light. A faint glow at the end of the corridor. The exit. A sob of relief caught in his throat as he pushed forward, bursting through a metal door and into the open. But the moment his feet hit the outside ground, his stomach dropped. A dozen men stood waiting, armed. Their cold eyes locked onto him, their expressions unreadable. David came to a halt, panting, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had run straight into another trap. Before he could react, a sharp crack split the air. Pain exploded across his jaw as the first punch landed, sending him crashing to the ground. Then came the kicks, the blows. Fists slammed into his ribs, boots crushed against his stomach. A heavy boot came down on his already injured leg, and he screamed. The world blurred. The sky spun. His vision darkened at the edges. Through the haze of pain, he saw Nira step forward, arms crossed, watching his brutal punishment unfold with a smirk. "Did you really think you could escape?" she mocked. David coughed, spitting blood onto the dirt. His body was failing him. His strength was gone. He wasn't getting out of this. Rough hands grabbed his arms, dragging him back toward the basement. His fate was sealed. David lay strapped to the cold metal table, his arms and legs bound so tightly that he could barely move. The harsh fluorescent light above him flickered, casting eerie shadows on the masked figures standing over him. They spoke in rapid Thai, their voices calm, professional. This wasn't their first time. A scalpel glinted under the light. His breathing quickened. This was it. One of the men, presumably the surgeon, adjusted the foreline attached to David's arm. A slow drip of anesthesia flowed through his veins, making his body feel heavier by the second. His eyelids drooped, his thoughts blurred. Nira stood in the corner, arms crossed, watching. No more sweet words, no more fake affection, only cold indifference. David tried to fight the drowsiness, but it was a losing battle. His mind slipped into fog, his limbs refusing to move. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears, slower, weaker. Then boom, the door burst open. Gunshots, screams, chaos erupted around him. Through his hazy vision, he saw masked men in black tactical gear storm the room, their rifles raised. The surgeon staggered back, raising his hands. Another man lunged for a weapon but was gunned down instantly. The kidnappers shouted in panic, scrambling to escape, but there was nowhere to run. David could barely keep his eyes open. His mind flickered in and out of consciousness, his body too weak to react. He heard shouting in Thai, heavy boots pounding against the floor, more gunfire echoing in the distance. A loud thud, then silence. A firm hand grabbed his face, forcing his eyes open. A Thai police officer stared down at him, his expression urgent. He spoke, but David couldn't understand the words. Everything spun. The officer moved quickly, untying the straps around David's wrists and ankles. The moment he was freed, his body slumped forward, but strong arms caught him. "Stay with me," the officer urged in English, his voice barely cutting through the ringing in David's ears. His body felt weightless as he was lifted, carried through the blood-streaked corridors of the hideout. Flashing red and blue lights flickered in the distance. More officers moved through the building, dragging handcuffed men out into the humid night air. And then there she was, Nira, on her knees, hands bound behind her back, surrounded by police. For the first time, fear flickered across her face. Their eyes met. David wanted to scream at her, to demand why, to let out the rage and betrayal clawing at his chest. But he was too weak, too drained. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Nira being forced into the back of a police truck, her fate sealed. Then nothing. Blackness. And silence. In the end, David's ordeal took a grim turn. He woke up in a cold, sterile hospital room, barely clinging to life. His eyes fluttered open to the harsh glare of fluorescent lights and the steady beep of machines, a soundtrack to his slow return to consciousness. Though he was weak and battered, one horrifying truth struck him almost immediately. He was missing a kidney. The realization came in a dull, throbbing ache that radiated from his side, a constant reminder of the brutal night that had almost claimed him entirely. Doctors and nurses moved about with clinical efficiency, treating his wounds and stabilizing his condition. But it wasn't long before a police officer arrived at his bedside. With measured words, the officer explained that David had been rescued thanks to a friend in Nigeria who had reported him missing. That tip-off had sparked an investigation into his last online interactions, a digital breadcrumb trail that led the authorities straight to the hideout where he'd been held captive. It was that very act of concern from across an ocean that had ultimately saved his life. Even as David recovered physically, the scars of betrayal were etched deep into his psyche. One memory, in particular, haunted him during his rehabilitation: the image of Nira during her interrogation. Instead of the soft, gentle woman he had once believed in, she had offered nothing but a chilling smirk, a cold, emotionless expression that spoke of her complicity and cruelty. She refused to utter a single word in her defense, her silence as damning as any confession. The officers had forced her into custody, and the last glimpse David had was of her being led away, her eyes locked on his with an unsettling mix of amusement and disdain. After several exhausting weeks in the hospital, David was finally well enough to return to Nigeria. He carried with him not only the physical burden of losing a vital organ but also the deep emotional trauma of his experience. Back in the familiar rhythms of his homeland, every day was marred by memories of that dark chapter. The once ordinary life he had known was now permanently shadowed by the knowledge that danger could lurk behind even the most alluring digital facade. Yet the nightmare seemed reluctant to end. Weeks later, as David attempted to rebuild his life piece by piece, an unexpected notification on his phone jolted him back into fear. A friend request had come through, from a profile featuring a beautiful Thai woman. Her messages, full of sweet promises and carefully chosen words, were oddly reminiscent of Nira's style. For a fleeting moment, David felt a familiar pull, a dangerous glimmer of hope mingled with dread. However, he knew all too well the peril that lay behind such messages. Without hesitation, he blocked the request, severing any possibility of falling into the same trap once more. Even as he took that decisive action, a final thought haunted him. The syndicate that had once ensnared him was not completely dismantled. Their insidious network, lurking in the dark corners of cyberspace, was still out there, always hunting for its next victim. The chilling possibility that someone else might soon be lured into the same deadly embrace gnawed at his conscience. David's story stands as a grim reminder of the perils of trusting too easily in a world where digital deception can hide the most brutal of truths. It is a cautionary tale, a warning to remain ever vigilant, for the shadows of that sinister underworld are never far away.